Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, Episode 20A, an interview on Garfield and the Gilded Age with Todd Arrington. I'm excited to welcome Todd Arrington to the show today. Todd is a historian at the James A. Garfield National Historic Site in Mentor, Ohio. He's author of The Last Lincoln Republican, the Presidential Election of 1880, and he's the site manager of possibly the best presidential history Twitter out there at Garfield NPS. Seriously, it is funny, interesting, and compelling. You have to give it a follow. Today, we're going to take a look at why Arrington considers Garfield the last Lincoln Republican, what we lost when he was assassinated, and how the Republican Party and the country were changing in the closing decades of the 19th century. Todd, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
The first question I have to ask is, what inspired your interest in President James Garfield?
Well, I am a historian, as you mentioned, by training and education, and my passion has always been the 19th century, specifically 19th century politics, the Civil War era. So Garfield was definitely in my wheelhouse of things I was interested in, but I really hadn't spent any time with him or gotten to know anything about him until 2009, when, of course, I'm a career National Park Service employee, and I came to James A. Garfield National Historic Site in Ohio. And again, knowing that this guy was certainly somebody I could get very interested in because of the time in which he lived and the era in which he was active in both the military and politics. But I really, got here and had to learn very quickly, and really just got fascinated by him and realized, wow, there's so much more to this guy than people really realize.
That is so how did you go from there, like finding and discovering him and finding an interest, to writing a book? I mean, that must have been a cool journey.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I am a historian, even though that isn't, my specific job here at this site. Everything I do is always, of course, going to have everything I do is always going to have a focus on history, and really just trying to figure out who he was and learning more about him. What I knew about Garfield was what everybody else knows. He was president very briefly, he was assassinated. But then doing a little bit more of a deep dive on him to really be able to prepare myself to go out and talk to people about him. I started to realize, whoa, this guy's really a major player in 19th century American politics. He's right there in the middle of so many of these major issues that the country is dealing with. And so starting to learn more about what he believed and who he was and how he felt about issues like civil rights, which has become, kind of the major focus that I have on Garfield. It really just fascinated me, and eventually led me down this road to do some deeper research and eventually write the book.
Awesome. And we are definitely going to dive into civil rights. I want to start at an even higher level. The title of your book, The Last Lincoln Republican. What do you mean by that?
Well, some have sort of jokingly accused me of putting Lincoln in the title just because, hey, if you mention Abraham Lincoln, of course it's going to sell books. I honestly never really thought of that, but I once I realized that, I liked it. But in fact, that really wasn't the intention. I guess what I mean by that is simply that in my view, Garfield is the last of kind of the original generation of Republicans to become president.
Got it.
And so I just kind of call them Lincoln Republicans because, of course, Lincoln is the first Republican president. Lincoln is the president who eventually leads the country through the Civil War, signs the Emancipation Proclamation, and really brings about the abolition of slavery. I think the country obviously would have been a very different place and been much better served than it was had Lincoln survived and been able to serve his second term and really institute his vision for Reconstruction. Obviously, that didn't happen. Things got, he was assassinated. Things got very, very, very ugly and bitter. And so really just what I mean by that is simply that Garfield is really the last of that generation of Republicans that really was very serious about trying to bring about equality for the formerly enslaved people in the South. I'm aware too, some people have sort of raised the issue of Benjamin Harrison, also kind of fighting for civil rights as president for African Americans, which is true. The reason I really sort of see Garfield rather than Harrison as that last Lincoln Republican, if you will, is simply, Harrison has some other issues, particularly with American Indian populations, that make it a little bit of a harder sell for him on civil rights. So yeah, he may have been very, very strong on civil rights for African Americans, but not so much for American Indians. Had Garfield lived, he might too have run into that, and maybe, who knows, done some things that were a little questionable with natives, but we just don't know, because of course he didn't live. So anyway, that's where the sort of the idea for this title, this last Lincoln Republican, comes from.
Awesome. So almost like one of the last founding fathers of the Republican Party, seems to be the concept.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. If you say, I think I guess James Monroe is really the last so-called founding father to be president.
Yeah.
Then you could also later that same century say, Garfield is the last Lincoln Republican, the last of that founding generation of the Republican Party.
Awesome. Okay, so it's pretty widely accepted that the two parties have evolved, over the last 150 something years. Even
yes, that's one way to say it.
Yeah, even switching positions entirely on some key issues like civil rights. So how is the Republican Party before Garfield different from the one after Garfield?
Well, the Republican Party obviously was the founding generation of Republicans were about equality.
Yeah.
Certainly economic equality of opportunity for Americans, and to some degree racial equality as well. That's not to say every original Republican was an abolitionist, because we know clearly that they were not.
Yeah.
We know even Abraham Lincoln had some ideas of that he explored colonization, for example. Lincoln is not Lincoln, like everybody else, is human. He's not perfect. Yeah. He evolves too. So the party, but then especially after the Civil War, when you get these so-called radical Republicans, who to me were not really all that radical.
Agreed.
All they're saying is everybody should have equal rights, including these African Americans who until recently were enslaved. That's not a radical position in my view, although I suppose maybe in the 1860s it was a radical position. But anyway, Republicans after the Civil War especially are basically just trying to make the country live up to what it claims to be about. That's what Lincoln was saying in the Gettysburg Address. That's what the new birth of freedom is. It's not only freedom of opportunity for people who had been enslaved. It's really making the country live up to what it claims to be about. All men are created equal, as it says in the Declaration of Independence. The Republicans are trying to get, after the Civil War, are trying to get the country there. Obviously, they run into a number of brick walls.
Right.
But by the time Garfield comes along in 1880, he's running for president in 1880. Reconstruction, is, according to most people, is over at that point. I would argue it's not really over even today in 2021, based on some of the things we hear over the last couple of years. I mean, it's really, let's face it, it's still going on. We're still trying to live up to who we claim to be and what we claim that this country is really all about. We haven't gotten there yet. I mean, we've made progress certainly, but we're definitely not all the way there. But anyway, by 1880, at least according to some, Reconstruction is over, and really a lot of Republicans, including a lot of former so-called radicals, are kind of starting to look forward and saying, okay, we've fought the Civil War. We've freed enslaved people. We have passed Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution. We've made the formerly enslaved people citizens. We've given them suffrage, the men at least. We've done enough. We've done everything we can do. It is time for us as a party to start looking for other issues. This is the major issue we've been arguing about and fighting about for the first nearly 30 years of our existence. It's time to move on to other things. where are we going to find alliances and people who will help us promote our party, promote our ideas, but also stay in power.
Now, why is that happening too? Why are they moving on from these issues and looking for new issues? Was there something happening on the electoral map? Was there something happening with the populace stopping to care? Why is the party changing?
Yeah, I think, well, certainly fatigue is fatigue with this issue is a major is a component there. I mean, we can't ignore that they, as I said, they've been kind of fighting these battles now for 25 years or more, or 30 years or more close. So I think that's a major issue. But yeah, I think, demographics are shifting. The electoral map is shifting. They're trying to figure out, how do we stay in power here? How do we build a base in the South? Is that even possible for the Republican Party to build a base in the South? If we continue, we as Republicans at that point, if we continue to hammer home ideas about racial equality and promotion of freedom for African Americans, that's not going to sell very well in the South. So if we have any hope at all of establishing a base in the South, continuing to win elections, appealing to voters in the South, we've got to move on to other issues as well. So yeah, I think a lot of it too was about, maybe trying to broaden their appeal and to stay in power.
Which is kind of sad, given that like half the South is African American, and you're almost kind of writing them. Like some states are majority, if I remember right, African American, one or two of them.
Oh, sure.
So yeah, it's kind of a sad
and those
statement.
are Republican voters at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
But then you also, of course, the flip side of that is you have white Democrats and white Southerners who are not shy at all about using violence, using intimidation, and trying to keep those African American Republican voters away from the polls.
Yeah.
But you also in 1880 do have some Republicans, James Garfield among the most prominent, that are saying, hey, wait a minute, we've not, we've done a lot, but we're not there yet. We can't just write these formerly enslaved people off. We can't just move on to bigger and better issues. We've still got some work to do in the South, and we still have some obligations we need to fulfill. So even though that has really very little to do with why Garfield is selected as a compromise candidate in 1880, I do still think that, unbeknownst to them, perhaps the Republicans selected the guy that I think was exactly who they needed at that point to really remind them who they were. And that then, of course, compounds the tragedy of him being assassinated shortly after becoming president, too.
Absolutely. And if I remember, like in his inaugural address, he talks about civil rights being one of the big things he wants to hit on. Do we get any hint anywhere of what kind of civil rights legislation he had in mind? Do we have any idea of what he would have attempted if he had lived?
Yeah, I don't know if he had any specific legislation in mind, because obviously, he can suggest and he can cajole and he can, talk to members of Congress about legislation, but he's the president. He doesn't instigate legislation.
Right.
So I don't know that he had any specific legislation in mind, but certainly, as you say, he did emphasize about a third or so of his inaugural address talks about civil rights. And I learned this recently. I had not done this research. In fact, on Twitter, which, you mentioned our Twitter handle there at the beginning.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Which we're very proud of, and we spend a lot of time and effort on, along with Facebook and Instagram too. I had a tweet from a guy who had worked for Bill Clinton when Bill Clinton was president.
Yeah.
And he had helped Bill Clinton write speeches. And I believe it was his second inaugural he was helping President Clinton on. And he said, as part of the research for that task, he went back and read basically every inaugural from Lincoln forward.
Wow.
And he said that other than Lincoln, of course, James Garfield was the only president to talk openly about civil rights in his inaugural address until Lyndon Johnson.
Whoa.
So, there's a great that's a stat for Garfield as well. So, but anyway, so Garfield, spends about a third of his inaugural address talking about civil rights, and saying this is an important, he calls what he calls the evolution of the the Negro race from slavery to the full rights of citizenship is the most important change we have known since the implementation of the Constitution. And he talks about how important this has been, and what a major what a major improvement this is to the life of the country, and it has freed both slave and master from a relationship that enfeebled them both. So he's really he's taking a pretty strong stance on civil rights. So I'd like to think, again, I don't know that he had any specific legislation in mind, but certainly I think he would have been far more active in protecting the voting rights of the freedmen, and he would have been far more active in promoting and protecting the physical safety of the formerly enslaved as well in the South.
Now, you mentioned Benjamin Harrison earlier, a president who 8 years later is gonna, as I understand it, work pretty dang hard to pass a civil rights bill of his own to protect African-American rights to vote, but he'll be defeated by congressional Democrats. So do you think Garfield would have been any more successful than Harrison was, and why?
Well, possibly, yeah. I mean, I don't off the top of my head recall if Harrison had a Democratic controlled Congress at that point or
I think he actually had a Republican Congress his first couple of years, and then it flipped, and he passed all this other stuff. But that was the one thing where the Democrats really stopped him.
Yeah. Garfield certainly would have run into a lot of Democratic opposition, certainly, because if you look at the electoral map from the 1880 election, it's really the first instance of the so-called solid South.
Yeah.
The South goes completely against Garfield.
Yeah.
4 years earlier, during the Hayes-Tilden election of 76, Hayes manages to win 3 southern states, South Carolina, Louisiana, Florida. Yeah, which, oh, by the way, happened to be the ones that tipped the Electoral College in his favor. And that's a whole nother interesting topic, that with that election being decided by an electoral commission, which, by the way, James Garfield was a member of that commission.
Yep.
Yeah. So, Garfield is, definitely willing to be a partisan Republican when he needs to be. And 1876 is a good example of that. But anyway, if you look at that electoral map from 1880, it is a solid South for Winfield Scott Hancock, who's of course the Democratic candidate that year, that Garfield defeats by, 10,000 popular votes, which is, a portion, a fraction of 1% of the vote.
Right.
It's a very, very razor thin margin in 1880. So the South is solidly Democratic. I mean, Democrats have certainly retaken control in all of those southern states.
Yep.
White Southerners have begun to very openly move toward restoring white supremacy, to intimidating and committing violent acts against African Americans, especially African American voters.
Yep.
So I think it's a safe bet that anything Garfield tried to do would have had very strong on civil rights, would have had very strong opposition from Democrats and certainly from Southern Democrats. So, how successful would he have been? It's hard to say.
Right.
And again, it depends on what the legislation would have been.
Sure.
What kind of sort of wheeling and dealing could have been done behind the scenes to make things happen. One thing I do think Garfield had an advantage over Harrison 8 years later was simply Garfield had spent a lot more time in Congress himself. So he was a master of sort of the parliamentary process of Congress, but also had been, the chairman of major committees.
Right.
He knew how the process, and again, he's comparable in that to maybe to a Lyndon Johnson, who was just revered as this guy who just knew the system so well and could make those deals that would convince people that otherwise would be opposed to vote for things he wanted them to vote for. I think Garfield is, to a degree, maybe comparable to that, in that he was in Congress for so long, 18 years prior to becoming president. And, Harrison, of course, had been a senator, but he hadn't spent nearly the amount of time in Congress that Garfield had, I don't believe. So I think Garfield had that advantage over Harrison as well, just knowing how the system worked and knowing how to make deals to get people to vote the way he wanted them to vote.
So it's we can't say what he would have done or would have been successful, but had he lived, the civil rights push might have lived for longer. but as it was, that was something that was changing. And over those last years, 19th century, civil rights goes from being a front burner issue to a back burner, if it's even on the stove issue. Another change that was happening around that time is, the Republican Party starts to become that kind of party of big business. I was curious, what's your reading of what's going on there? Why is that happening? And do we have any inclination of how Garfield felt about that change?
Yeah, Garfield, I mean, obviously, the first thing to know about Garfield is, like anybody who manages to become president of the United States, mostly, he's a masterful politician. So he's
Yeah.
very smart. He's very, he can read the public mood very well. And he can also kind of, to some degree, kind of have a sense of the future of where is the country going and where's the party going.
Mm-hmm.
So, Garfield was not anti-business by any means.
Mm-hmm.
He in fact, here in Ohio, when he was running his front porch campaign in 1880, many of the people who came to see him, he had groups of people that were coming here that he would talk to, and several of them were business groups, businessmen from Cleveland, businessmen from Indianapolis, all these different places, who wanted to get their concerns in front of this presidential candidate as well. So he was not an anti-business Republican by any means. I think Garfield was a guy who, he called himself cursed by being able to see both sides of every issue. So I think, Garfield is a guy who I think maybe would have said, hey, yes, these business concerns are important,
Mm-hmm.
but we can't emphasize these over the civil rights of the formerly enslaved. So I think Garfield is a guy who, and again, being a masterful politician, I think would have been able to maybe keep all of these things going at the same time.
Yeah.
But why are the Republicans moving toward big business at this point? Again, as I said at the beginning, they're looking for new issues, they're looking for new alliances, and they are seeing a lot of wealthy industrialists and financiers who are willing to help them not only push their agendas, but to help them stay in power. Since you mentioned since we talked a little bit about Harrison, something else to consider is, how the Republicans are very, very sort of on the sly, pushing for new states at this point too.
Yeah.
There's obviously Garfield isn't president long enough to
Right.
sign any, to sign legislation admitting any new states. But after Garfield, the Republicans, including during the Harrison years, are very, very, I guess I shouldn't say on the sly, they're very overtly trying to bring more and more states
Mm-hmm.
in, because that creates more and more Republican state
Yep.
legislatures and more Republican members of Congress and the Senate. So, how would Garfield have felt about that? I don't know. I mean, he was not above being a partisan Republican when he needed to be. That 1876 election is a great example of that. But that's another reason that the Republican Party is really starting to shift and change a little bit in that late 19th century, especially after Garfield's death.
One of the other issues that I know is starting to emerge in these decades after the Civil War that you don't see like anything about before is kind of the struggle between labor and management. Like you have, say, some great railroad strikes during Hayes' administration. You have some more coming later. Do we have any sense of where Garfield fell on that spectrum of like favoring management and, say, supporting the breaking of strikes or supporting labor, and things that aren't really going to come for decades in terms of labor support?
Yeah, I think, Garfield being Garfield, I think he probably would have taken each one of those situations individually and said, well, okay, who's in the right and who's in the wrong? And if there's this major labor strike, for example, who's going to be affected? And, is there some way to bring these two sides together? He was a pretty masterful negotiator and mediator. So, I don't have a good sense of, he would have favored management every time, or he would have favored labor every time. I think it's more a matter of what is the issue and how can it be worked out? And, really who's in the right and who's in the wrong. He did try to he did have something of a moralistic streak to him, which I think came from his upbringing and from his religious views.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think he also was very strong on really what's good for my constituents as when he was a congressman, and as president, what is good for the country. And if that means that these workers in this labor dispute are in the right and they should be accommodated, then great. And if management is right and these demands are unreasonable, then maybe we side with them. So again, I'm speculating here, obviously.
Totally. I get to ask all the fun speculative questions here.
Yeah. But yeah, it's hard to say. But I do think, knowing Garfield, he would have taken each one of those instances and tried to figure out, what is best here.
All right. So the last area of real kind of struggle and change in the GOP I'd love to dive into with you is the fight where we very much know where he's going to fall between Roscoe Conkling and James G. Blaine. Whether it's at the convention in 1880 or as president, Garfield finds himself right in the middle of a fight between two arguably more powerful Republican politicians, James G. Blaine, who led a faction called the Half-Breeds, and Roscoe Conkling, who led a faction called the Stalwarts. And we've talked in my podcast a bit about how Conkling was all about old school patronage and accumulating power basically through corruption, while Blaine favored civil service reform. I guess first question is, were there any other areas where those two factions differed that I kind of missed, or was it really a debate about, are we going to favor this old school patronage, kickback system, or are we going to move beyond it?
Yeah, I would challenge a little bit of that. I don't know that James Blaine was frankly all that concerned about civil service reform.
Okay.
Yeah. And so Blaine had very, very regularly during his career in Congress used patronage.
Yeah.
He was not opposed to the patronage system. James Garfield really had used patronage as well. In fact, I recall at one point he was having this kind of squabble with Ulysses S. Grant when Grant was president. And I remember Garfield making a note in his diary about Garfield had made a recommendation for a postmaster position. It's a patronage job, and Grant had appointed someone else, and Garfield was a little ticked off about that. So I think the major issue, certainly in 1880, the Half-Breeds are starting to come around to the idea, this civil service, something's got to be done here. This patronage system is kind of getting a little out of control. Guys like Conkling loved patronage because it made them very powerful. It gave them a way to build a base and to have people owe them favors. If you had given them their job, they owed you. It allowed the party to be very powerful too, because a lot of times people that were put into these patronage positions were expected to basically kick some of their salary back to the party. I think the major issue there is certainly in 1880, even more so than civil service reform, was simply who is going to be the Republican candidate for president in 1880. The stalwarts were all about having Ulysses S. Grant come back and run again, which had never been done before. No one had ever sought a third term before.
Third term, yeah.
And the Half-Breeds, yes, concerned somewhat about civil service reform, but even more so were in very, very direct opposition to Grant or anyone seeking a third term.
So the issue was the third term, is your sense of it?
In 1880, at least, I think that was even more of a dividing line for Republicans between stalwarts and Half-Breeds. Civil service, James Garfield, really was never all that passionate about civil service reform until he was really president-elect.
Yeah, he kind of read the room.
Yeah, well, he read the room, but also he started to see how much time is being wasted on, again, as president-elect, and then certainly once he became president as well, is how much time was being wasted on having to meet with people. Because keep in mind, this is the 1880s here. It's not like today where, because of civil service reform, you apply for a job and you have to go through a process and you have to be qualified. And, the president of the United States has no idea who I am or that I'm in some civil service job, because, I don't have to go stand in a line of people at the White House and beg for a job. So Garfield, really started to see, how many people were showing up here at his house when he was president-elect, and then at the White House when he became president, and how many hours a day he had to spend talking to these people and wasting time hearing their concerns and what job they wanted, from people who wanted to be, ministers or ambassadors, all the way down to people who wanted to be postmasters or, or clerks. They all were expected to be seen, and so that's really when Garfield, I think, started seeing the need for civil service reform. And he makes a note in his diary that, this is some reform here is going to be necessary. But in 1880, the dividing line between stalwarts and half-breeds, they were all Republicans. They all had felt strongly at one time or another about abolition, about emancipation, about civil rights, even though some of them, again, were starting to kind of, really cool off on civil rights at that point. But the real dividing line there in 1880 was simply who's going to be our candidate in 1880. We, the stalwarts, want Grant to come back and run for a third term. We, the half-breeds, say, no, that's totally inappropriate. We don't want that. Oh, and also there were some scandals here and there in the Grant years. We don't want to go back to that. We need somebody else. And that's where Garfield comes in as a true dark horse compromise candidate in 1880. Yes, Garfield was aligned more with the half-breeds in 1880 because he did not want Grant to run for a third term.
Yeah. Got it. Very interesting. You write of Garfield, he was the best president we never had. What do you see in him that makes you see that greatness was possible?
Well, I mean, I think there's no question he was just based on pure intelligence. He was one of the smartest men ever to live in the White House. I mean, he was possibly, genius IQ level, possibly brilliant. He spoke multiple languages. He wrote multiple languages. Although I will say the whole, there's this old wives' tale about him being able to write Greek and Latin in, simultaneously with two different hands. That's an old wives' tale only. That is not true. He could not do that. He could speak both, he could write both, but he couldn't do it at the same time. He was also, in my view, one of the best prepared men, currently all men, obviously, to ever be president, in that he had done so many different things. He had been a teacher. He had been a college president. He had been a lay minister. He's the only person who has literally preached the gospel that has ever then later become president. So he's the only minister to become president. He was in Congress for 18 years. He's a general in the Civil War. He's a staunch abolitionist. He's a staunch supporter of civil rights. So I think for me, the best president we never had, that is not my, I didn't come up with that phrase. Somebody else did, although I think it's apt. It's simply that I think he was, the potential was there. He and again, all of these things that he had done that led him to be this compromise candidate, to be, in my view, even though he barely won this election in the popular vote, at least, it was pretty decisive in the Electoral College, led him to be the person that the Republican Party needed in 1880, and really in the person that the country needed in 1880. All of these things, that led him to win the presidency and to become president, they represent to me that lost potential and the great tragedy of his death. I don't know that he would have been, the end all be all for civil rights. I think the potential for that was there. Circumstances may have overwhelmed him. Some major foreign policy crisis may have come up that he had to deal with. Who knows what would have happened had he lived?
We know that as a guy who follows him, Arthur, he's going to have to deal with this Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yes,
a lot of pressure for that,
Sure. And Arthur is another guy to me that, gets, certainly deserves criticism for signing the Chinese Exclusion Act, but also deserves some praise for overcoming his own past as a, kind of a Republican Party hack.
Yeah.
And who owes his entire career to patronage, and yet, does this complete about face and signs the Pendleton Act. I think Arthur is another fascinating guy who deserves more credit than he gets. Again, gets some criticism that he deserves, but also doesn't get enough credit that he does deserve. so who knows where Garfield would have gone. I just think that the potential was there for him to be a very strong president. Obviously, at the park where I work, when we are tweeting or putting things on social media or even doing programming, yeah, obviously we emphasize that, not that Garfield would have been a great president, but that he could have been a great president.
Right.
The potential was there. Everything in his background, everything he accomplished in a very short life, really. I mean, he was only 49 when he died.
Yeah, he's got an impressive resume. He's one of those guys you read about and you're like, man, I am lazy.
yeah, that's true. I do the same thing. I just think, wow, when he was the age I was, he was, he was like being elected president, basically.
Right.
So it's just the potential, really. Yeah. I think, and so the best president we never had. Again, that's kind of a nice convenient phrase that somebody else came up with. I don't know who, but I do think it represents. It just speaks to the potential that he had to really be a strong and effective president.
What was his most lasting legacy of his, whether it's short administration or life and career?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I mean, there are many. I mean, obviously, kind of based on the conversation we've been having here and a lot of the stuff that's in the book, and the civil rights, his belief in civil rights. Not only his belief, but him kind of putting his money where his mouth was and supporting a lot of civil rights legislation. I think that's a very strong legacy, and one that really is one that people don't realize about him, which is one of the things that I think is great about the angle I was able to take in the book. I'm not trying to oversell him as someone who would have been again, as I said before, the end all be all when it came to civil rights. But I do think the potential was there, certainly, for him to really have been very strong and very impactful on that. So that's one of his legacies. I think, too, it's a sad legacy, but it is a legacy that the idea of medical care in the 19th century. I mean,
wash your hands.
Yeah,
sanitize your stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, European doctors by 1881 had really, by and large, accepted Joseph Lister's theories on germs and the need to use antiseptic surgery. There's a great book out there called The Butchering Art by Dr. Lindsay Fitzharris that talks about Lister and kind of how he developed these theories and how widespread his theories became in Europe. But certainly by 1881, a lot of American doctors weren't quite there yet, and they were kind of sticking with the more blood and gore I have on my hands and my my surgical apron. It just shows how much experience I have, and so I think that's a sad legacy of Garfield's life. That had he been shot even maybe 10 to 15 years later, I think he quite possibly could have survived, because American doctors had much more widely accepted germ theory at that point. So that's a legacy of his as well. And again, it's a sad one. And then some of the other legacies for people who come to our site in Ohio, they, when they get to, we take them through the Garfield home. They see a home that, looks very different than when he lived here. And one of the things that we show them is this beautiful memorial library that his wife, his widow, Lucretia Rudolph Garfield, built onto the back of this house a few years after his death. And it turns out that, in fact, what this library is, not only is a beautiful room, a beautiful addition to this house, it's also where the idea of presidential libraries was born.
That's an awesome legacy. And it's to Lucretia's credit.
Oh, absolutely. And, Lucretia, I think maybe that's another legacy of Garfield's, is for all of us in the world that have definitely married up. I definitely count myself among those. His wife was also a really, really fascinating person, fiercely intelligent, very, even though she was, she reminds me of Abigail Adams in some ways, in that she has very strong opinions that she shares privately with him. Of course, she doesn't speak out publicly yet. She's still a woman of the 19th century.
Yeah.
But she's also in her own right very, very interesting. And she becomes very, one of the goals of her life after his death is to keep his memory and his legacy alive. And so she builds this beautiful library, and lo and behold, it's where the idea for presidential libraries comes from. So I think that's one of her legacies and one of his as well.
I've got one last question for you. You mentioned Garfield has all this experience, congressman, general, president for a bit, all these things. When you look through all that, what lessons in leadership do you think we can learn from him?
Wow, that's a great question. And again, there are so many. I think, embracing, varied experiences is really important. Not everybody needs to be a general or needs to be, a member of Congress for 40 years or something. It doesn't mean their ideas don't have value if they're running for higher office, for example. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, but embracing varied experience. I think, being true to who you are, I think, is valuable as well. Garfield could have been one of those guys that kind of turned his back on civil rights, as he moved towards the presidency. He didn't do that. And it's just because he was a very strong believer in this cause, and stayed true to that, even when many of his colleagues were starting to kind of, again, move on to other things and looking for other issues that would help them. So, I think Garfield is just he's an underappreciated figure in American history. I recognize that he's not ever going to rise to the level of an Abraham Lincoln or a George Washington.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that he should. We just don't have the data there to tell us that he should. I often will, say on Twitter or things like that, I think had he lived and served a full term or two, he maybe he would have cracked the top 10. With the new C-SPAN list just came out a month or so ago of presidential greatness. I was very happy to see Garfield went from 29 to 27 this time.
Hey.
I think that's pretty darn good for a guy who was really only in office for 4 months before he was shot.
Yeah.
So that means there's over a dozen presidents below Garfield, most of whom served a full term or two sometimes, that historians think Garfield was better than. That's pretty impressive. So, I think he could only move up had he lived to serve a full term or two. The other leadership lesson I guess I would take from Garfield is be willing to change your opinions, be willing to grow, be willing to listen to what other people have to say. And I think the best example of that is, it's fairly well known among people that are interested in Garfield that, he was not always very happy with Abraham Lincoln. Today, almost everybody, including historians, rightfully reveres Abraham Lincoln. He's, again, think about that C-SPAN ranking. Lincoln is always at the top. He's always number one. Sometimes you see other polls that put him at number 2 below Washington. Lincoln and Washington will always be 1 and 2, we'll say.
Yeah.
Washington may sometimes jump above Lincoln, but for the most part, it's Lincoln then Washington. And that makes sense to me as a historian. But, Garfield, during the Civil War, when he was both in the Army and also in Congress, was very frustrated with Lincoln sometimes. Garfield wrote a great letter, one of my favorite letters to quote, 2 days after the attack on Fort Sumter. So April 14th, 1861, he writes this letter to a friend, and he says, "The war will soon assume the shape of slavery and freedom.
Right.
The world will so understand it, and I believe the outcome will redound to the good of humanity." So here's a guy who in 1861 recognizes already, immediately upon the beginning of the Civil War, okay, it's really all about slavery.
Yeah.
Historians, we know that now.
Yeah.
Regardless of the fact that some people don't want to go down that road or don't want to admit it, there's a lot of sort of ancillary issues, but they really all can be traced back to being related to the issue of slavery, economics, the Constitution, whatever you what have you. it's really all about slavery. And Garfield recognizes that. And he's so furious that Lincoln won't come out and say that same thing. He's so irritated that Lincoln won't make emancipation of enslaved people. He won't make abolishing slavery part of what the Union is really fighting for. Yes, he eventually does that with the Emancipation Proclamation. And Garfield makes this sort of snarky comment in his diary when the Emancipation Proclamation finally comes out, where he says, strange that a second-rate Illinois lawyer should be the instrument of this wonderful proclamation. So
Ouch.
he was pretty harsh. So he didn't always agree with Lincoln. However, and here's the leadership lesson that it's taken me 10 minutes to get to here, and I apologize. Later, certainly after Lincoln is killed and Garfield spends more and more time in Congress, he comes to recognize that, Lincoln knew what he was doing all along. He was pretty smart. Garfield came to see the genius of Abraham Lincoln. And by the time he himself, Garfield, becomes president, he, of course, is singing the praises of Abraham Lincoln. So the lesson there is simply be willing to listen to what other people have to say. Be willing to change your views. Be willing to see both sides. I mentioned earlier, Garfield literally called himself cursed because he could see both sides of every issue. And that can be hard for a politician sometimes when you need to take a stand. Yeah. So, but be willing also to evolve in how you think. And I think Garfield's sort of evolution on how he felt about Lincoln is a good example of that.
If you'd like to hear more from Todd, please check out his book, The Last Lincoln Republican, The Presidential Election of 1880. Visit the James A. Garfield National Historic Site in Mentor, Ohio, and give @GarfieldNPS a follow on Twitter. Thank you so much for your time, Todd. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends about the show, and leave a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. It's good to hear from y'all. You can also follow the show on Facebook at Abridged Presidential Histories or on Twitter at APH Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/Abridged Presidential Histories. This helps me buy books and pay to host the show. And thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music on today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Gar Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, I'll talk to UNC historian Claude Clegg on the history of Barack Obama. That's right, we are jumping out of order to talk about Obama, his legacy, American race relations, and the challenges and opportunities of writing contemporary history. That's next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.